Right, good evening, everybody. I think we'll get moving, and anyone else, obviously, that will join us can join us along the way. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our PRism webinar on improving and reducing inputs from fertiliser. Tonight, I'm delighted that, along with Emily, that presented us the soils webinar last week. And if anybody does want to recap, if you weren't here last week and you'd like to receive the recordings, do send me an email and I can send that on to you. And apologies if anybody's struggling with receiving the event invites. I know a few of you, I've had to resend it individually because it seems to be going into people's junk boxes. So if you don't ever get an invite and you wanted to join any of the webinars, just ping me an email and I'll make sure I send it on individually. That seems to stop it going into people's junk once I send it on individually. I have muted everybody, and if everyone can stay muted throughout, apart from if you once we get onto questions, when we do the questions, then obviously I'll call you out to unmute yourself to ask those questions. It just stops any background noise whilst we're going through the presentation. So thank you for that. And as we do go through the presentation, I'm sure Joel won't mind you asking any questions. So either use the raise your hand button, which is at the top of the toolbar at the top, or type it in the chat box and I'll ask Joel the question at an appropriate time, or I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask the question. And no question is a silly question. If you're thinking it, then somebody else probably is also thinking it. So don't sit back and think of a question, but don't be too shy to ask it. Just ask away and hopefully Joel will know the answer. So Joel is from Integrated Soils. He is an independent plant and soil health educator, and he has a lot of interest and knowledge about sustainability in food production and getting the best of that. So his extensive practical knowledge, both from Australia, the UK and Canada, which is where he currently is, will hopefully be able to give you a really good insight where you can make changes and things you can do back on your systems. So he will explain on how you can hopefully reduce the reliance on fertiliser and make your businesses more sustainable for the future. So I think without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Joel. And yeah, if anyone has got questions, either use the raise a hand or type it in the chat as we go through. Over to you, Joel.
Okay, thank you very much, Katie, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Looking forward to the session tonight. I will just share my screen here and then we will dive in to the presentation. It's a little bit, hopefully that's okay. Okay, so, oops, oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk on about reducing inputs and strategies in which we can use to try and help reduce that dependency. Of course, these days with the fertilizer prices being generally a bit volatile, obviously a year or two ago there they were spiking and they've come down a little since then, but generally there does seem to be a lot of volatility and or even issues with sourcing and supply. So I think for various motivations, there's lots of good reasons to be thinking about alternative strategies to help manage fertility. And that doesn't necessarily mean eliminating these, but it just means maybe reducing that dependency on them, which ultimately is going to add to the resilience of the farming system. So it's worthwhile nonetheless. So here's kind of roughly where we're going to take the presentation today, a little bit about nutrient cycling and some of the reserves that you have already in your soils, and therefore how we can try and just leverage that fertility that's already there. We'll talk about some practical strategies that helps do that, how we can integrate many strategies together. And then we'll kind of take a bit of a focus on nitrogen, how maybe some excess nitrogen, or how nitrogen can be a bit disruptive to soil health and soil organic matter. Then we'll talk a little bit about how plants use nitrogen and how we can kind of help to minimize some of those negatives. And wrap it off with a bit of discussion around pastures and multi-species pastures and the use of legumes and how they can obviously be an important piece of that discussion. So, of course, it all starts with photosynthesis, and that's really where Plants are how they grow, of course. They have this very important ability to be able to breathe in carbon from the air. And they take that gaseous form of carbon and they fix it into something chemical, something physical in their bodies. And that first product of photosynthesis is glucose or sugar. But then that's really just the building block in which the plant then uses that sugar or the carbon from that sugar to grow its roots, its shoots, its stems, produce flowers, fruits, tillers. I mean, absolutely anything and everything that the plant kind of does or requires. It all stems from that first building block, the sugar molecule. And that, of course, comes from thin air, that carbon dioxide. And that's why plants are so special in this discussion, is that they have the ability to simply use the energy of the sun and recombine that gaseous carbon into chemical forms that can then ultimately provide energy and provide building blocks for the system. And so this is really the process that we want to try and optimize. And that's really by default when we talk about some of the things like soil health principles, for example, and keeping the soil covered. You know, this is really what that's about. It's about saying, well, we want to keep the soil covered with green plants as much of the year as possible so that we are capturing sunlight, so that we are maintaining photosynthesis, particularly in those shoulder seasons. And of course, that's where a pasture-based system by default, a perennial pasture-based system by default, has a huge advantage over annual production and the arable systems, which is that you keep green leaves permanently on the soil, therefore keeping this process of photosynthesis turned on and keeping that carbon coming into the system, because it's the carbon that comes in out of the air and we bring it down into the plant soil system, where it then provides many benefits and provides really energy and fuel for the system. So this is really saying the exact same thing we were just talking about with a little more detail. It's the carbon dioxide and the water that stitch together to build sugar or glucose plus oxygen as the byproduct. But the key point here is that the plants also require essential macro and micronutrients, which form part of enzymes or catalysts that help to facilitate this process. So without optimized plant nutrition, the plant cannot fully complete or optimize this process of photosynthesis to generate that building block, that sugar. And as I was just explaining there, that is just the building block. Then the plant turns that sugar into anything and everything that it is made up of or that it requires. So be that from sugar, larger sugars, carbohydrates, amino acids, proteins, oils and waxes, other smells, flavor compounds, if that's relevant, other defense chemicals, various colors, pigments, all sorts of things, and indeed everything that the plant is made up of. It all comes from really the carbon in that sugar. But again, if we have a plant that is nutritionally imbalanced, that doesn't have optimized macro and micro minerals that help to also catalyze this second step, well, again, the production of these quality enhancing compounds like protein, you all will appreciate the value of protein in the diet of the animal. Well, if we don't have optimized nutrients to help build those proteins, well, of course, then animal performance will be suffering, will be limited. So this just emphasizes that everything, photosynthesis is really the basis of all of this discussion, but we have to optimize plant nutrition in order to optimize this photosynthetic process. And plants don't just breathe in carbon from the atmosphere, they also release carbon, and they primarily do that by taking those sugars that are photosynthesized up in the roots, up in the leaves, up in the shoots, and they send the carbon and the sugars and that energy down to the roots to grow root biomass. But also some of that carbon is leaked or excreted out of the root system as these root exudates, and this is what we might call the liquid carbon. This is this very leaky, highly digestible, highly available carbon compounds, sugars, etc., that are leaking out of the root system. And there's lots of different compounds here we could talk about, but the main ones are sugars, organic acids, and amino acids. These kind of more smaller, simpler molecules are the primary ones. And the plant releases particularly things like organic acids to slightly acidify the soil in order to help to strip nutrients, release nutrients off the soil particles, off the soil minerals, to release those nutrients, the essential macro and micronutrients to be taken up. And again, those nutrients will be used to prime more photosynthesis, to prime more sugar production or more production of these other organic acids, these types of things. So yes, plants, they can acidify, they can release these acids which will help to solubilize nutrients and make them available. But also that's really one half of the equation. We have the other half, which is some of those sugars that we were talking about. And these really are particularly food sources for the life in the soil, from the microorganisms all the way through up to some of the larger ones. And this is really the sugar or the energy for these organisms, who then also have a very unique and important ability to strip minerals from the soil, release nutrients from the soil, making those available for, again, for plant uptake, again, to photosynthesize and return that favor. So we see what we're seeing here is this sharing or this trading of carbon from the plants into the soil, and the microbes get that carbon and they deliver nutrients back to the plant, and the plant gets those nutrients back to then produce more carbon. So it's this trade, this symbiosis, this trade between them, carbon ultimately for nutrients. So this is why the plant invests heavily in the microorganisms, particularly who are very good at making nutrients available. And so this is one of the first and obvious ways in which, when we have a discussion about reducing fertilizer inputs, is that we have to support a healthy soil, particularly soil biology, to feed those organisms so that they make nutrients available. And the point here is to say that actually for many, many soils, you do have lots of nutrients in them already. And when we do a soil test, however, we only measure the very small amounts of the total pool that are there. So we often measure what's available, what's more plant available. And this is actually a small percentage of the total. And so it's valuable to kind of have a bit of an understanding here of the different pools of nutrients that do exist. The smallest fraction is what's in the soil water, the soluble pool, the nutrients that are soluble floating in the soil solution. That's actually very small, and yes, that's a pool that plants do easily take nutrients up from. Anything that's by default soluble in the water can enter the plant relatively easy. We have a slightly larger pool called the exchangeable, and these are the nutrients that are stuck to or sit on the soil particles. And these are a bit more medium-term supply. They're relatively available as well. They're called exchangeable because the plant will release some of those organic acids that we talked about, the hydrogen, and acidify that surface and exchange the nutrients. So these are also relatively plant available as well. But we do have this third pool, the total pool. This is what's generally considered insoluble and unavailable. This is maybe nutrients that are locked up with each other, maybe some nutrients that are still embedded in the parent material or the mineralogy of the soil. So some of this more long-term supply that's still to be liberated through generally what would be considered through long-term weathering and release. But indeed, the microorganisms, they can access this total pool. They can unlock these and liberate these. And this is really the essence of the approach when we say, oh, let's reduce inputs. It's about facilitating the microorganisms, the biology, to make these reserves available. Now, if you have a very light sandy soil, yes, it's true, your total pool, the size of this total circle, is going to be much smaller than maybe how I've represented it here. But if you have a medium silty loam soil, or certainly a heavy clay soil, then this is a really accurate depiction. You have a very large reservoir, a big bank account of potential nutrients that are there, they're present, but just not yet unlocked, just not yet cycled. And so that's really the strategy, is about leveraging what's already there. And how much is already there? Here's two examples, both from the UK. Just giving you some examples of the first column is what would be considered the plant available fraction, whereas the over here we have that total pool. So looking at the much larger. Let's just cherry pick a few examples. Phosphorus is a common one. Well, here you can see that the fraction of phosphorus that's actually available is 22, but the total amount in this soil is 800. So you can see there's many times over more phosphorus there. What about potassium is another common one. We often talk about P and K. Well, potassium, the available fraction is 169, but the total fraction is 488. So you can see this is just a different soil, different area. It's the same pattern. You can see here's phosphorus again, 11, but we have 700 total. potassium 284 available, okay, 5,800 odd in the total pool. So there's the actual figures to put this kind of picture in context. Yes, you have big reserves there, and really the focus is about just unlocking those. And really that's the key in order to do that is this process here. It's about helping the plant photosynthesize, send carbon down, feed the biology, and get them to cycle and liberate those nutrients. But we also have some of these other emerging ideas and understanding in the world of soil science. Here's a good example: the rhizophagy cycle. Some of you might have come across this one before, and this is a fairly emerging concept that points out that actually plants eat microorganisms, that particularly bacteria, they can get engulfed in the very root tips. As those root tips are growing, they grow through cell division, and as those cells are dividing in the root tips, some bacteria from the soil actually get kind of internalized or engulfed by the plant as it's kind of growing, and they become what's called endophytes, or microorganisms that now live inside the plant. And it turns out that as these microbes enter the plant root system and migrate through that root system, the plant can send specialized chemicals down there to actually degrade the bacterial cell walls and strip the nutrients out of those cell walls, so stripping the nutrients out of the bacteria. So it turns out that plants actually feed on microorganisms and use them to extract out nutrients. Once the plant has finished extracting those nutrients, it will actually spit out those bacteria, where they can actually reform or rebuild the cell walls, redock nutrients, repack nutrients back into their bodies, where they can actually, even in a cyclical basis here, kind of repeat that process. So this is just pointing out that actually here now we're talking about plants using biological forms of nutrients, using organisms as their food. And this is pointing out, in contrast to this model that says, well, the nutrients have to be soluble to be available. Well, actually, those nutrients in the cell walls of the bacteria, they're not soluble, they're not exchangeable, they're not in the total pool. They were once here, but now they're in the biological form, in the body of the living organism. So here we have a pathway of nutrient uptake that doesn't really even consider the chemical properties of the soil. It's about through these biological pathways. So that's the essence. If then we're trying to reduce our reliance, we've got to support those biological processes. And that may mean also, as part of an integrated strategy, however, to still be using some fertilizer inputs. I'm not opposed to some what I call strategic fertilizer use. I don't think fertilizers in small doses, in modest doses, they're not so damaging to soils, to function. It's really when they're over applied, or a kind of long-term over application, where we start to see a lot more kind of maybe negatives creep in. So I think strategic, modest applications of inputs, and I think in the context of, beef and sheep grazing, you're all fairly on modest applications already, say, as compared to more intensive systems like dairy or arable systems. So I think of all the systems out there, you folks are on the better end of the spectrum, let's put it that way. But nonetheless, there can be ways to use fertilizers in a targeted way that's not minimizing some of those negatives. So that could be, for example, things like foliar applications, avoiding the nutrients in the soil at all, just delivering it directly into the plant, or what I call carbon-based inputs, so mixing nutrients with carbon-based inputs, and that carbon acts like a sponge and helps to bind and stabilize the nutrients. And really, that idea is really mimicking what organic amendments do. So the use of compost and manures, these types of organic materials that would be very common, I'm sure, for many of you folks, using livestock and using the manure component there. But really beyond that, then it's about, well, how best can we use the animal and the grazing techniques to also optimize that biological feeding of the soil, and to optimize that nutrient leveraging, cycling of those nutrients. So it's about managing the animal and the grazing techniques. Then also, of course, the pastures that they feed on. Can we bring legumes in, use multi-species to leverage the fertility, deeper rooted species to again leverage those total pools of nutrients towards production. So that would be kind of common ones for you folks. Beyond that, if any of you do, if there's a couple of you maybe that do have any arable or some mixed cropping there, Sure, we could use things like cover crops, companions, intercrops. Some of these have relevance for making better use of the soil's fertility, making use of crop residues, or the use of biofertilizers, microbial inoculants, or biostimulants. Some of these other things, these other added inputs that are not necessarily always directly delivering nutrients to the plant, but maybe delivering microorganisms or stimulating microorganisms to then deliver those nutrients. So it's more of these indirect pathways for nutrient supply. So let's have a quick look at a few examples of some of the negatives of nitrogen. Nitrogen is particularly a culprit here. Excess nitrogen can be a bit more damaging to the soils, and it's the one that we do have to be careful of. Of course, we have quite an over-reliance of nitrogen, generally speaking. So it is the one that's also very leaky, very reactive. It enters the waterways, enters the ecosystem very easily, and can be causing a lot of environmental degradation. So it is an important one we should be looking at. So here's just to bring a bit of context and nuance to this discussion. However, here's a great study that was looking at how nitrogen impacts soil biology under grassland versus crop arable systems. And so you can see what they found is that nitrogen inputs decreased the soil microbial biomass by around 12%, particularly in grasslands. And this negative effect was associated due to reductions in plant species diversity. However, they found that under annual arable type systems, that mineral nitrogen inputs actually increased microbial biomass by 13% odd. And this is, they theorized here that the microbes benefited from the higher residue inputs after the annual crops were fertilized, harvested, and we have more residues, that residue was able to then stimulate or feed the soil biology. So here I'm giving you just a nuance that says, well, this study is suggesting, and I would say there's others that point in the same direction, this is pointing out that nitrogen may be a little more disruptive in perennial grassland-based systems because they have that advantage that we talked about before, being green cover for the full season. It's not a short burst of production and then we have bare soil. We have full cover, so we have nature's design working for us better, and that's where then nitrogen can be a little more disruptive to that system versus an annual arable system, which is already limited because it's not capturing so much sunlight and photosynthesis across that whole year, and therefore in that context the nitrogen maybe had a bit more benefits in terms of increasing production. Here's a study out of the UK, this is from Rothamsted, looking at the effects of nitrogen on plant species diversity in a grassland context. And you can see here where we have control, where there's no nitrogen fertilizer, we have much greater plant species diversity. But as soon as we start to feed the soil with fertility and enrich that soil, we actually start to select for the plant species that thrive under that nutrient-rich environment. And as you can see here, it was particularly some of the grasses here that really began to dominate and then crowd out or smother out some of those other species. So we're losing plant species diversity as we enrich the soil with excess nutrients. So, and then what about on soil organic matter? We all appreciate the importance of soil organic matter. It's good for soil health, good for feeding soil biology, good for soil structure, good for holding on to nutrients, water, moisture, etc. So what about the effects of nitrogen on building soil organic matter? And it's a nuanced picture here on this discussion as well. But the key point here is that what we see is that when we apply nitrogen to plants, it, for the most part, really does a good job at encouraging above ground biomass. That's why it really drives yield. It stimulates more above ground biomass. And this was a great study out of the US looking at wheat and corn, as you can see here. And when we increase the fertilizer effects, yes, we increase the biomass production, but that is above ground. What they showed is that actually the root biomass production was much the same in these low fertility treatments versus high fertility treatments, that the root biomass production was much the same. And that's important because actually it's roots that primarily help to build soil organic matter, not so much what's above the ground, particularly if we're cutting and harvesting, grazing, or combining what's above anyway. It's roots that are the main driver. So nitrogen does not necessarily encourage great rooting. And here we have a graph here, which is a summary of 3 other studies that shows even a bit of a suppressive effect. As we increase nitrogen fertilization, we're looking at that, we're comparing this to the below ground allocation of carbon, so how much carbon, photosynthetic carbon, comes down to below ground. And you can see that as we increase nitrogen, we begin to actually decrease the amount of root biomass and root production, the amount of carbon that goes downwards to the soil. So that then has these negative effects on building soil organic matter, primarily because we are suppressing and not optimizing root biomass production. So it appears that nitrogen can have negative effects on building soil organic matter. And okay, that's really relevant and really important in annual arable cropping systems, which already have small root systems. And this is why we see arable systems losing soil organic matter, much more so than what we do in perennial systems. It is because, the point we touched on earlier, because you're perennial and you maintain green cover, maintain photosynthesis, maintain that carbon pump coming down into the soil. But it is also because perennials, by default, because they're perennials, because they're going to come back again next year and come back again and come back again, by default, they grow more roots. They allocate more carbon down into those roots because they put nutrients and energy and carbon down there for storage for the winter so that they can use it to mobilize, that following spring. So that's why all perennials, they produce a lot more roots for kind of storage. So these negative effects of nitrogen are very concerning, I think, on cropping systems, but still have relevance even under pasture-based systems where, okay, I know all of you will have much better soil organic matter levels than any arable farmer for the most part, I'm sure. Probably 98% of the time that statement would be true. But that doesn't mean that we therefore can, or equally, we still have to have some caution here in terms of some of those negative effects. And
Joel, can I just ask a question?
Yep, sure, anytime.
Do all forms of mineral N have the same effect on soil biomass?
Okay, we're going to move on to that part of the discussion next. So that I'll answer that. It's the answer to that one is coming up. So, and lastly on this slide, what I just want to point out here was that this, what we're talking about here, this point I was making is still relevant in a grassland system too. For example, our perennial ryegrasses. Yes, of course, they're very good productive varieties. They've been bred to be very productive, but that has been a bit of a trade-off. They do produce good above ground biomass, but they often don't produce as good root biomass. And so I think that the modern varieties that are very productive, that's a great asset. It's great that they're productive. That helps with your economics, bottom line. But if over time that productivity is coming at a cost of less carbon allocation below ground, less root biomass, this over time maybe is going to be more degrading of the soil function, of the soil system. So we just got to strike a better balance between above ground and what we have to harvest with below ground and what we need for soil health and environmental sustainability, those types of things. And that's of course where then maybe there's some interest in recent years with multi-species pastures, choosing some of those deeper rooted plant species to be part of a mixture along with some of the productive grasses, but also have some of the maybe lesser productive grasses, but good for their rooting traits and characteristics. So when we talk about soil organic matter, it's not just carbon that is soil organic matter. It's also made up primarily of carbon, but also some nitrogen and phosphorus, sulfur. Some of the other nutrients are present in soil organic matter as well. And there's a growing awareness that actually the soil organic forms of nitrogen that come from that soil organic matter are very valuable and important for plant growth and plant productivity. And this is where we're going to start to answer the question that we just had. We're going to kind of move into this discussion now. Because it turns out that, yes, we generally have not considered too much about the organic forms of nitrogen. We've been very focused on the inorganic forms because they're the ones that come from the fertilizers, the ammonium, the nitrate. So we've been very focused with our research and understanding how these inputs work, and less so on the organic fractions. And so that's beginning to change. We have a bit of a shift and a realization and interest in the studying the soil organic nitrogen. There's quite a few papers that have come out in recent years. I'm just going to quote you this one. It's a nice review of the topic. I'm just going to cherry pick some quotes here to read to you. So here they point out that for more than a century, crop nitrogen nutrition research has primarily focused on those inorganic forms, building that traditional model that agricultural plants predominantly take up nitrogen in those organic forms of the nitrate and the ammonium. However, results reported in the ecological and agricultural literature suggest that this traditional model of plant nitrogen nutrition is oversimplified. We propose several mechanisms by which organic nitrogen uptake and assimilation may increase nitrogen use efficiencies, such as by reducing the nitrogen assimilation costs. So that's what we're going to talk about answering your questions. So these organic forms are very efficient or favorable for plant utilization. These organic forms also help to promote root biomass. We're going to talk about this in a second. Those organic forms are very important to help shape soil biology. The biology like organic forms of nitrogen too. They like amino acids and proteins. They like these too. And really then helping the benefit of these organic forms is they help to align the plant demands, the delivery and the supply of nitrogen with plant demands. The problem with those inorganic forms is that they're very leaky and reactive, and we put too much of them on at one time when the plant maybe is not synchronized, when that supply of that nutrient is not synchronized when the plant maximally needs it. So organic forms, because they're a bit more slower release, they're a bit more stable in the soil, they are better able to synchronize their supply, their release, when the plants actually require them. So here's kind of the traditional model. Many of you would be familiar with this word mineralization. We say that the soil organic matter needs to be mineralized or breaking down, or what mineralization really means is releasing inorganic forms from the organic forms. So we're releasing ammonium, which can be converted to nitrate, that we have to mineralize the soil organic matter first to release the inorganic forms, then plants take up. And what we really now understand is that actually from that soil organic matter, you have these organic fractions like amino acids, little chains of amino acids, and actually the plant can take these up directly. These organic forms can be taken up, and they're very favorable for plant growth. And then yes, some will also still be mineralized, and yes, the plant can make use of both of these forms of nitrogen is really the key essence here. And this is a nice image really depicting this. The classic view really dominated our thinking about nitrates and ammonium, but it turns out that these slightly larger, more complex organic molecules like amino acids, like chains of amino acids called peptides, or even longer chains called proteins, these organic macromolecules, we used to think they were too big and that the plant couldn't take them up. And that's why we kind of disregarded them as a source of nitrogen for plants. But it turns out that yes, the plant can take up these various organic forms of nitrogen, even larger things like proteins. And it turns out that the plant releases specific root exudates intentionally to strip these out of the soil organic matter, to get these proteins and peptides and amino acids out of the soil organic matter and take them up and utilize them. So yes, these larger organic molecules can also be used. And we take that a step further, as we talked about already with the rhizophagy cycle. It turns out that even plants can engulf whole bacteria, and whole bacteria are ginormous even compared to these other organic molecules that we were just talking about. So bacteria are even bigger again. And yes, we now know that the plant can also take up these large things, relatively large things like bacteria, and even extract and digest them for nutrients as well. So that's the key message, is that plants can make use of inorganic forms and organic forms and these biological forms such as bacteria. And that's what we really want to try and enhance and support. So when the plant takes up these different forms of nitrogen, what does it do with them? Where does it go? What's the end goal? What's the end point here? And the answer to that is that the plant wants organic molecules of nitrogen. It wants things like proteins. It wants to build things like chlorophyll, the site of photosynthesis. It wants to make its DNA. All of these things involve organic forms of nitrogen. And that's really what the plant wants with any of these sources of nitrogen. It wants to kind of build these to help build its body. And so that means that when the plant takes up nitrate nitrogen, as an example, the plant doesn't keep it as nitrogen, nitrate, nitrogen. It actually will convert it, and this is called metabolism, or this is a metabolic pathway that you're seeing on screen here. So the plant will shuttle this nitrogen along this pathway, ultimately to turn it into these organic molecules that are very functional, like amino acids and proteins, etc. So first nitrate becomes ammonium, then ammonium becomes amino acid, then amino acids get stitched together to form proteins. Now, if we apply urea, urea actually, although we think about it as a synthetic fertilizer, and it is, and we maybe consider it as a, we might put it in that category of inorganic nutrient, but technically it's not. It's actually an organic form of nutrient. It's got that carbon in it, so it is organic. But it's a bit of a special one. We're going to come back and talk about this one. But nonetheless, urea as an organic molecule, of course, we have urea, and animals do in our urine, of course. We find urea there. So it is an organic form of nitrogen that can be taken up and actually is very favorable for plant growth. But nonetheless, urea comes up. It also is converted first into ammonium, which then is moved into amino acids, and then onwards to these other organic molecules that the plant really is chasing. So that's called nitrogen metabolism. That's the metabolic pathway. But this doesn't just happen on its own. We also need other nutrients and things to facilitate or catalyze this process. So let's kind of start to answer your question there earlier. What are the different values of the different forms of nitrogen? How efficiently do they help the plant? And what you're looking at here is kind of represented what I showed you here too, is that if we look at the metabolic pathway of ammonium, you can see as ammonium comes in, it has a one step to get into the amino acid, that which is called glutamine, this first amino acid here. So it's a one-step jump to get from ammonium into amino acid. And we need certain nutrients for that. It's manganese and magnesium. Now, nitrate, on the other hand, nitrate has a much longer pathway, as you can see here. So first nitrate comes in, then it has to be turned into something called nitrite. Then that nitrite has to be turned into ammonium, and then that ammonium is turned into the amino acid, into the organic form. So the length of that pathway means that nitrate induces a greater drain or drawdown on energy because it's a more expensive form of nitrogen for the plant to use. The plant has to make use of more energy, utilize more energy to ultimately use that nitrate. And the nitrate needs different nutrients for it to be converted. Molybdenum and sulfur are required, iron is required, and then again, magnesium and manganese. So these other nutrients are also important, but I'm just pointing out that this is a short pathway, this is a long pathway, and therefore actually ammonium has some efficiency gains over nitrate because it's less demanding, it has a shorter pathway. Now, these two nutrients also do very different things to the plants in terms of the growth response. And what we find is that plants that are high in nitrates, they actually produce more above ground biomass. And that's because when the plant takes up nitrate, it actually has to send the nitrate up into the leaf where we need sunlight, where then that nitrate is converted down that pathway. So nitrate is primarily converted above in the leaf, not a little bit in the roots, but primarily up in the leaf. And so that's why, because the conversion happens up in the leaf, it encourages more above ground biomass. And that differs from ammonium. When ammonium comes in, ammonium is converted into the amino acids, into those organic forms down in the roots. So ammonium encourages a bit bigger rooting, a bigger rooting response, and nitrate encourages a bit bigger above ground response. Now, you might think that sounds better if you're trying to grow more grass for productivity. But and yes, that's true in the short term, but you've got to take a full season approach here. And particularly as some of our summers in the UK are becoming a little more drier, it seems to be the pattern, very wet in the spring and autumn and maybe drier in the middle, is that this bigger root system that you are growing earlier on then pays dividends later on, because that bigger root system means that you are accessing deeper soil volume, leveraging more of those nutrients that we talked about, feeding soil biology better to then get the nutrients and the moisture from that soil and have that greater resilience during those dry periods of the summer. So it's a bit of a balance. You want a bit of both. They're both quite okay in the system, but it's just about, I would argue that we lean a bit too dominated on nitrate we want to balance that with some of these other forms.
Joel,
so now
can I
I've
just
fleshed
ask
out that.
another
Yes,
question?
please.
What's your view on the impact of protected urea?
Oh, now there's a big question. I'll try and give a brief answer. Look, I think it has its time and its place. I'm open-minded to it as one tool in the toolbox, but I'm not so keen. I think we are being a little too um, we're emphasizing its role and its contribution a bit too much. I think we're leaning on it too heavily as this to be the solution to this problem. My concern around urease inhibitor, and there's also concerns with the nitrification ones too, but in the example of urease, that inhibitor that we want in the soil to kind of block the urease enzyme to prevent urea converting into ammonia gas, that very same inhibitor can be absorbed by the plant and taken into the plant. And it can actually suppress urease inside the plant. And that is a big concern because right here, I was about to talk about the additional synergistic nutrients that we then need to facilitate this pathway. Nickel here is part of the urease enzyme. And we have evidence that shows that those inhibitors can enter the plant where they block this right here. They do exactly the same. They block the urease enzyme, which induces urea to be stuck as urea, and it can cause urea scorch or can cause burn. So you can induce a toxicity and imbalance because if the plant has too much urea, it also doesn't want that. It might be an organic form of nitrogen, but it's not the right one. It's a great building block, but it's not something that we want excess of. And so those inhibitors, I do have concern because they are interfering with this metabolic pathway that we're in the middle of talking about at the moment. And the nitrification inhibitors equally, there is some concern. We have evidence out of New Zealand that they do end up in the milk. Those chemicals have been shown to be in the milk, and I've read some of the safety studies on this, and they do say that it's fairly low risk. It's a fairly low chance that it would cause any problems in the food chain. But there still is a bit of unknowns in this. I think the jury's a little bit out. So look, I do have some concern, but I think maybe for very high risk environments, judicious use of those materials is okay. But I certainly would not be I'm going to talk briefly about foliar nitrogen at the end, just 2 quick slides about this, but I would not be including urease inhibitors with a foliar nitrogen, that is for sure. And I hear that the foliar nitrogen is exempt from the policy that is coming into the UK this year. So I'm encouraged to hear that. But I do have, to answer your question, I do have some concerns about their use.
Okay, and we've just had another one as well. How do you make magnesium and phosphorus locked in sticky soils more available?
Sure. So if you've got a sticky soil, that's quite possibly an indication that you have a little bit high magnesium. And that might sound a little counterintuitive, but actually it's very common that plants growing in high magnesium soils can often be magnesium deficient. And that's because exactly what you're pointing out, magnesium is a bit of a monster. It tightens the soil. And not only does that limit other nutrients or lock up other nutrients, it even locks up itself. So the best kind of simple answer I could give to that is that a bit of extra calcium in the soils, and that could be lime or gypsum, depending on your soil pH, or a combination of those, but either one of those, that's going to help to provide calcium. And calcium, outside of its discussion about pH, calcium helps to physically open the soil, improves soil structure, and helps to open up that magnesium so that it's not so tight and sticky. So I would suggest that optimizing calcium, and that's independent from optimizing pH, but optimizing the calcium can help to physically open up the soils and improve magnesium and phosphorus release. Yeah, that's a bit of a generalized answer. I'd need to see a detailed specific soil analysis to kind of know and get a feel for that, but that's a bit of a general answer there. Okay, so here I was just going to add another layer to this discussion about nitrogen metabolism, is that the urea, the nitrate, they don't just move down this pathway miraculously. They need these specific nutrients to help catalyze or facilitate this process. So in order to get that nitrate onwards into ammonium, you need molybdenum, sulfur, iron. We mentioned that. To convert urea, you need nickel. Nickel, of course, isn't a heavy metal, but very small amounts are essential to the plant. When we talk about nitrogen fixation from the legumes and the bacteria associated with them, of course, things like molybdenum, iron, nickel, and phosphorus are very important to bring some of that free nitrogen in, and it kind of comes in at this point, again, converting that into ammonia, which quickly becomes ammonium. And then we need that manganese and magnesium, as I mentioned, to convert that to the amino acids, the organic form. And then we need lots of other nutrients for good and optimized protein synthesis. So things like phosphorus, sulfur, and magnesium, especially these top three, are really important here, but also manganese, boron, potassium, zinc also play a role. So what I'm pointing out here is that it's not just about fertilizer nitrogen management or nitrogen application. It's also about these other nutrients that work with nitrogen. Because if you can apply all the nitrate, if you want to apply all the nitrate in the world, just keep on applying. If you have a molybdenum deficiency in that plant cannot make use of that nitrate. And the nitrates then can just build up and up and up, where they can become, like I mentioned with urea, they can become toxic, or they can develop a dysregulation in the nitrogen metabolism and process, so that it can start to have negative effects on plant health and plant growth.
Joel, we've lost your slides.
Oh, have you? Oh, I wonder why that is. It's a funny thing today. It's I've used Teams before, and it is a bit funny. I don't know why. So now if I go back to there, is that okay now?
Yeah, we've got them back. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, so you couldn't you couldn't see what I was pointing at here, but okay, so yeah, this is really this point, just saying that all these nutrients in the red boxes are needed to convert each step of this kind of pathway. So if you have again, like last example, if you have a molybdenum deficiency, you can apply lots of nitrates here, but it's not going to be able to move along the pathway. You need these nutrients to facilitate the movement of the nitrogen along the pathway to these kind of more quality enhancing organic forms like amino acids, and particularly the proteins. So these are the nutrients that are very, very important as part of the nitrogen discussion. Nitrogen does not operate in isolation. So then if we come back to this point about the efficiency of the different forms and what does the plant do, we talked about the classic view of plant nutrition and nitrogen nutrition that was heavily focused on these inorganic forms, the nitrate, the ammonium. What does the plant then do, as we're pointing out here? What does the plant do with these? Well, these are just building blocks. The plant will turn them into these organic forms. So it won't remain as ammonium. It will stitch carbon into that and build little amino acids. And then it will start to stitch amino acids together to form what's called these little peptides, little chains of amino acids. And then it will stitch those together to build these larger, more complex, useful, functional proteins. And so the point here when we talk about nitrogen use efficiency is that, well, okay, what if I just then delivered to the plant these organic forms of nitrogen? Because then we're saving the plant's energy on converting the nitrates or converting the ammonium. We don't have to do any of these earlier steps back here. Let's just deliver amino acids, these organic forms of nitrogen. And it turns out that they're very efficient for the plant growth for the exact reason that they're already organic, that they're already halfway up the pathway. So if I go back to this slide, if we are feeding these amino acids and little peptides and proteins up here, well, of course, all of the below ground stuff happening down here, not below ground, but further down the pathway, becomes irrelevant. We can just deliver these organic forms that are further up the pathway that are actually more efficient. And that's the point. They have an efficiency gain. And they are more efficient because they're already organic, and so they're saving the plant's energy. And this paper here kind of summarizes this point really nicely, so you can just capture a good understanding of why this is. So here we're looking at the carbon bonus of organic nitrogen and enhancing nitrogen use efficiency with these organic forms. So the chemical form of nitrogen that's taken up, whether inorganic, like nitrates, or organic, like amino acids, may significantly influence plant shoot and root growth and nitrogen use efficiencies. The key point here is that the carbon cost, or the energetic cost, of assimilating and making use of those organic forms of nitrogen and turning those into proteins is lower than that of those inorganic forms that have to go long down that pathway, fully down that pathway, draining more energy along each of those steps. And this is mainly because of the organic form's carbon content. It's the embedded carbon that gives them this efficiency gain. And this carbon makes it more beneficial for plants to take up organic rather than inorganic forms of nitrogen. And so this is going to summarize this nicely for you. We're going to do some carbon economics here. So let's look at and compare nitrates, ammonium, and then two organic forms of nitrogen, two amino acids here, glutamine and arginine, just two examples. So we're looking at the carbon cost of making use of these, and let's start with these first two. So the carbon cost, again, remember the plant doesn't want nitrate. It is going to photosynthesize, take carbon from photosynthesis and stitch that carbon into the nitrate to build the amino acids. That's really what it's going to do. It's building amino acids, building protein. And that really simply means when we say converting inorganic into organic, we're simply talking adding carbon. And so that's the energetic cost. We are draining photosynthetic carbon. We have to make use of photosynthetic carbon and stitch that into this nitrates to then turn it into these organic forms. So you can see here the number here is 5.81. So this is kind of the amount of grams of carbon the plant requires to make use of a gram of nitrate. So it's 5.81. Now, because nitrate is inorganic, there's no carbon embedded in there. We get no carbon bonus or rebate, so to speak. So therefore, the net costs remain the same at 5.81. Now, you can see here ammonium, it is less than nitrate, 4.3. And that's because ammonium is further up that metabolic pathway. So this is why ammonium is more efficient than nitrate. You can see it requires less carbon, less energy to make use of it. But again, it's still inorganic. It contains no carbon bonus, so the net costs are the same. However, now, when we come look at our organic forms of nitrogen, these amino acids, now, once again, yes, there are carbon costs associated with using these organic forms, such as the plant expends energy to absorb them out of the soil, to translocate them around, to get them where they're needed. So there's still energetic cost to acquire them, to make use of them. However, they are special in that they have carbon embedded in them already. They're already an organic molecule. The plant is absorbing that carbon. It doesn't have to photosynthesize it, which is very energy intensive, expensive. The plant is just absorbing that carbon from the soil through that organic molecule. So that is, in essence, that means we get a carbon bonus or a rebate on the cost of that acquisition. And so that then brings that the net cost to make use of the organic forms, as you can see, is much lower, 2.16 or 3.02 here. These are much lower than the cost to the plant to make use of inorganic forms. Okay, so that is why these organic forms are more efficient, because they save the plant's energy, and because they're organic, and that's what the plant wants anyway. So that's the crazy thing. We feed the plant inorganic forms, and then the plant spends all this energy turning them back into organic forms. So what if we just feed the plant the organic forms in the first place? And that's the idea. And that's why things like organic amendments, manures, composts are valuable because for many reasons, but one of which also is that they do supply these organic forms of nitrogen.
Joel, I've got another question.
Sure thing.
If applying organic forms of N is worthwhile trying to get carbon nitrogen ratio right first? For example, mixing hen muck with a carbon source like wood chip.
Yes. Yes, your point is right. You do want to optimize the carbon to nitrogen ratio. We don't want to be applying too much carbon without a balance of nitrogen, and we don't want to be applying too much nitrogen without a balance of carbon. It goes both ways. And so something like hen muck that is pretty high in nitrogen, and if you don't have any bedding or anything to go with that, then yes, it can be pretty nitrogen rich and can be pretty hot. It depends on the freshness, of course, of that. But yes, so therefore that idea of just trying to stabilize that and blend a little bit of carbon, like wood shavings, wood chips, etc., just to help mop up or stabilize some of that nitrogen, yes, is a good idea, because even though it might be from an organic source, such as manure, it can still have quite a high proportion of inorganic nitrogen in there. It can still be quite hot and behave a little bit like an inorganic fertilizer. So yes, you are right in the premise of your question. Yeah. So this is relevant then when we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, because we generally talk about nitrogen use efficiency as the total amount of nitrogen in plants relative to the amount applied. But if we really break that down into more specifically, what that's really talking about is the nitrogen uptake efficiency. So of how much of the nitrogen that I applied, how much of that was taken up by the plants? How did we minimize losses? We don't want too much in the environment, of course. We want to minimize those losses. So of the total that I applied, how much was taken up? So that's really more technically called the nitrogen uptake efficiency. But we have something else called the nitrogen utilization efficiency. And this is defined as the plant biomass or the plant yield relative to the total nitrogen in the plant, reflecting the capacity of plants to convert the nitrogen that they acquire into biomass or into yield. So really what that's saying is that once I get nitrogen into the plant, how much biomass can I produce per unit of nitrogen? And it is that definition, the nitrogen utilization deficiency, in which the organic forms of nitrogen then have more importance and relevance, is because, as we just talked about, they save a lot of plant's energy. So the plant can use that energy, that photosynthetic carbon, it can use that elsewhere for more tillers, for deeper roots, to fill bigger grain, whatever it might be, to grow more biomass. And so that's why the organic fractions are of interest, because they can really help to improve this utilization efficiency, the growing of biomass per unit of nitrogen. So that also, one of the other sources of organic nitrogen then of course can come from legumes. And not just legume residues or legumes in the diet of the animal, but also through some of their roots and root exudates. Legumes are also, they release a lot of nitrogen-rich nitrogen-rich root exudates. They release a lot of those amino acids, these organic forms, in which then the grass companions can take up with them. So that kind of leads us into this discussion a little bit about diversity, and just pointing out that, well, if we can integrate more legumes into the pasture stand, and generally, yes, more species diversity generally, it helps with a lot of things, as this kind of visual is pointing out, but legumes particularly in the mix, of course, are helping with the nitrogen piece of the puzzle. But beyond that, sure, having other deep-rooted plants, as we talked about earlier, that's going to help these plants access not only more moisture at the soil depth to add to the resilience in the summertime, but also adding some of the some of those total nutrients, and some of those nutrients at depth or that have leached away. We can recapture those and bring them back into the productive zone. So that's kind of really the benefit of the diversity. We can leverage better use of what's there through more diverse stands of plants, but particularly integrating more legumes can of course help specifically with the nitrogen picture, which is what we're going to expand on a little bit. But like always, grazing management is important too. And in order, yes, this is a nice picture, and yes, we have these nice deep-rooted plants that you can see here, but in order for those plants to really establish those nice deep roots, they need to be managed properly for that, and that means adequate recovery and rest periods for grazing. And if we are set stocking and keeping the grass at this kind of pastures at this height, you're not going to develop those nice big root systems. So we want the above ground to really have time, a rest period, in order for it to fully express its above ground biomass. And when we do that, we are also fully expressing the below ground biomass. So we do have to be thinking about rotational grazing and and pushing that out as long as you can manage in your system. Of course, I think this is much more of a challenge in the dairy context, where you're looking for that much higher productivity, quality feed for productivity. But I think in a beef context, you have a lot more opportunity for this. I know sheep also get a little bit fussy as the pastures get a little too mature. So again, you've got to strike that balance within your context. But I would just emphasize the point that as long as a recovery and rest period that you can manage, the better. This will help to encourage deeper rooting and more of this root biomass and better nutrient access and cycling to leverage your fertility there. So, and of course, I know you've got to strike that balance with the pasture quality. You know, you don't want it to get too rank either, but there's maybe somewhere in the middle here that I would encourage you to be trying to optimize. Now, when we bring legumes and diverse plants generally, but legumes also into this picture, it's really just about having this diversity effect, this interaction effect. And that really just simply means that as compared to a monoculture, and okay, I know I've got a cereal legume example here, but it would be true of a grassland. If we have a monoculture of perennial ryegrass, well, it's only got one set of root exudates that it releases, the carbon that it leaks out to feed the biology, to stimulate the biology, to cycle those nutrients that we were talked about at the beginning. Well, it only has one set of root exudates to do that. And if we bring another plant partner into the mix, like a legume, well, legumes have a different set of root exudates. They speak to different parts of the soil microbiome. They can unlock and activate and wake up different microbes. So when we bring these two root systems together, we start to see this interaction effect, whereby the grass or the cereal is benefiting from the microbes that the legume is activating, and equally the legume can benefit from some of the microbes that the cereal or the grass is activating. So we're looking at this synergy, this interaction where 1 plus 1 can equal 3. So the interaction between the two is greater than the sum of the individual parts. It's that kind of idea. If you have if you have your grass in monoculture and you don't have a legume there waking up these different unique microbes, well, of course, this plant is never going to get access to those or receive the benefits from those. So that's really also what we're trying to stimulate with diversity, diverse plant stands, is some of these interactions that are uniquely found and observed in more diverse systems. Now, specifically on the nitrogen topic, yes, legumes, they can and do share nitrogen with the non-legume in real time in the current growing season. It's not just when they die and decay or their root turnover that it releases. Yes, that's a big part of it. But even while the legumes are alive and living in real time, they can interact with the grasses, for example, and share nitrogen. And they do that through one pathway, as I just mentioned already, is the root exudates. Legumes do release a lot of amino acids as root exudates. So when we have good root intermingling, the grasses can scavenge those amino acids. And of course, those amino acids are organic forms of nitrogen. So very efficient, very favorable for the grass to make use of those amino acids. So that's one pathway. But the other pathway is through mycorrhizal fungi. The legumes can also share, again, it's usually amino acids, organic nitrogen, directly through mycorrhizal fungal networks, who will then deliver that nitrogen to the non-legume, to the grass, in a grassland context there. So yes, in real time, in the current growing season, legumes can share nitrogen with their non-legume companions. So we do have these mechanisms that we have identified. There's a big question about how much nitrogen does legumes share? And certainly we can say for sure it's much more in a pasture-based system than it is a cropping situation. Cropping becomes a little difficult when you don't have as good root-to-root interaction and contact. You've got to have those roots intermingling. So it's not as optimized in a cropping situation, but it does still happen, does still work. But in a pasture situation, it is definitely much more, because you have such higher seeding rates, much more root intermingling. You've got much more close, intimate relationship there between the legume and the grass for some of that sharing. So let's have a look at some of these examples. I'll share a few quick studies, keeping my eye on the time here. I know that we've had some questions as we've gone along, which is good. We'll have whatever questions we've got left at the end as well. But so we've been taking some as we went along, so that's good too. So here I want to share this one. This one's really interesting. I'll read the title for you, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but when you watch back the recording, if you'd like to, you can pause and have a read of the full abstract on the left there if you really want to. But I'll summarize for you. This is a good study here looking at grass legume mixtures and highlighting that they can yield more nitrogen even than a legume pure stand due to mutual stimulation of nitrogen uptake from both symbiotic and non-symbiotic sources. I'll summarize kind of what they did here, but I'll read you these key points. So we describe how legume proportion modifies the nitrogen acquisition from different sources. Symbiotic nitrogen fixation was stimulated in mixtures as compared to monocultures. So this is interesting. What we have identified is that when we have a grass and a legume together, as compared to a monoculture of legume, what that does is combine a nitrogen-hungry plant like the grass with the less nitrogen demanding plant legume, who has this special ability to bring nitrogen into the system. And what happens when they grow together is that nitrogen-hungry grass constantly is stealing nitrogen from the soil, taking those amino acids, stealing those ruticuloids from the legume. It's scavenging the nitrogen that the legume is bringing into the system. And by doing that, by constantly stealing and taking nitrogen, that actually forces the legume to keep on fixing more nitrogen, to fix more nitrogen than what it would under a monoculture situation. Because under a monoculture situation of legume, the legumes start to release that nitrogen out into the soil and it starts to build up. And as it builds up, that's perfectly fine and normal. As it builds up, it sends a signal or a switch to the legume that says, okay, you have enough nitrogen around here now. You don't need to fix anymore. So you can stop and focus on flowering or on seed yield, filling grain, etc., etc. So it's as nitrogen builds up in the soil, that provides the trigger or the signal to tell the legume, okay, you don't need to fix anymore, you've got enough. So when we have a nitrogen-hungry plant like a cereal or a grass who constantly is stealing or depleting the soil reserves of that nitrogen, then the nitrogen never builds up to that critical threshold to send the signal to stop fixing nitrogen. So therefore, legumes keep on fixing nitrogen, So here, this study showed that the legume mixtures will actually yield, grass legume mixtures will yield more nitrogen than a legume pure stand. And beyond this, they then found that the uptake of nitrogen from the soil nitrogen pools, so nitrogen access from the soil organic matter, for example, was also stimulated in mixtures as compared to the monoculture. So again, they showed that a combination of grass and legume was also better able to leverage and access the nitrogen from the soil organic matter, more so than the monoculture. And then they found that once all of that nitrogen was acquired, either from the soil or through fixation, that then the plants were more that nitrogen was used more efficiently by the mixtures for biomass production. So that's that nitrogen utilization efficiency that we were just talking about earlier. So they showed that actually the mixtures were able to then, per unit of nitrogen that they accessed, the mixtures were able to produce more biomass, more yield, as compared to either of the two monocultures. So I think it's a really nice example of the benefits of more legumes. They bring free nitrogen in and they add a whole lot more benefits than just nitrogen, but okay, that's a big one that we often focus on. Now here's another one from Ireland. This is more in a dairy context, but still it illustrates the valuable role of also some legumes in the mix. Here we're comparing a perennial ryegrass monoculture with two different mixes, and mix one is just adds on some to the perennial ryegrass. They add on was it Timothy or Coxville? I think it was Timothy, as well as red and white clover. And then on the mix two, they also added some chicory plantain as well, and some yarrow. So a couple of extra of those kind of herbs. So then we're comparing then a monoculture ryegrass with these diverse mixtures across a nitrogen fertilizer gradient. So let's kind of start with the baseline. When we apply 0 kgs of nitrogen to perennial ryegrass, here's our production, okay, 6 tons. That's with no fertilizer. As soon as we add 120 kgs, of course, we begin to increase the biomass production of that ryegrass. Okay, so of course, that's what we expect when we add fertilizer. But if we come over here and look at our mixes, well, even at 0 kgs, by having those 2 legumes in there, the red and white clover, well, here's our baseline production. Well, you can see that we've already out-yielded that. Because those legumes are doing the job for us in both of these treatments. The 0 kgs of nitrogen are out-yielding the 0 kgs of ryegrass. Once we go up to 120, okay, now we've increased biomass production. The grass likes that nitrogen, of course. If we come over here, well, look at that. Our 0 kgs is still out-yielding 120 kgs on the mono ryegrass, and same again in our mix 2. Now we go up to 240 kgs of nitrogen on the mono ryegrass, and now we've increased production again. We've stepped up again, just below, say, 12 tons here. Now we come over here. Okay, now we can see here our mix 1 is slightly below. It's still 0 kgs, slightly below low yield, but come on, like not by much. It's a very small margin. If we look over here to our mix 2, we can see that actually mix 2 with 0 kgs of nitrogen is actually yielding pretty much exactly on par with 240 kgs of nitrogen on a monoculture ryegrass. So it's bring legumes in for the nitrogen and a bit of extra diversity for some of those deeper roots, etc., to also help to leverage that fertility that's already there. It's as simple as that. And I think this study really nicely kind of demonstrates some of the efficiency gains. And I've got one last study here to share. Well, look at time. I've got to keep an eye on time too. I've got a few more things I want to talk about just briefly after these. This was another diversity effect on a study on a grassland. This one's from Lithuania. And here we're also comparing productivity of single species and multi-species. So we're comparing monocultures to mixtures. But again, they were doing this over a nitrogen gradient at using 0 kgs of nitrogen and then 150 kgs of nitrogen per hectare. And what they found is that by increasing diversity, increasing the species richness, this had a positive effect on the dry matter yield and produced better quality forage when compared to the single species swards. It was particularly the protein in the forage of the grass legume mixtures was much higher than in the grass monoculture. But when they looked at this nitrogen effect, they found that the nitrogen applications had a positive effect on the single species swards, but actually decreased the yield of the multi-species swards. So here they showed that actually once we have diversity in place, that even this 150 kgs of nitrogen was too much. It was starting to have suppressive effects on those diverse swards and actually lowered the yield in that instance. So here we have a great example of illustrating that it's not just one potential benefit that comes from diverse swards. It's that you can use less nitrogen. It may be that you have to use less nitrogen in order to optimize the productivity of those diverse swards. Now, I know they come with other challenges, with their management and things as well. So look, farms usually have many fields. I'm very open to that we may have some more simpler fields with just a good kind of grass clover mix. I think that has its place too, and maybe some other fields with maybe some more multi-species swards. I'm sure there's kind of benefits a bit to both sides. And like we were talking about, like you all know with nitrogen and legumes, if you apply nitrogen onto a legume, the rhizobial bacteria, they get lazy because the legume doesn't feed them. The legume doesn't need the nitrogen if we apply it too much. And I just was sharing this study quickly just to point out that there are other bacteria in the soil that can fix nitrogen beyond rhizobium, and some of these other bacteria also associate with grasses, with cereals, with brassicas, with all sorts of other plants. And this was just a study to show that actually the same principle applies. Wherever you apply nitrogen fertilizer, you have suppressive effects also on some of these other nitrogen-fixing bacteria who also can associate with grasses, with cereals, etc. Now, for brevity of time, I'm going to scoot through these last few slides just so we make sure we have some time for questions at the end. I was just going to mention briefly that foliar applications are one tool, one strategy to still be using a bit of nitrogen for optimizing production, but trying to keep it out of the soil, because it's when nitrogen builds up in the soil is where it has these suppressive effects on and fixation. It's where when nitrogen builds up in the soil is where it can become more leaky, leach from the soil, etc. So the more we can keep nitrogen at a modest level in the soil, means it's going to be better in terms of these efficiencies and minimizing some of the negatives. And that's where foliars can have a role and I know it's probably more relevant again, maybe in a dairy and arable context, but I'll mention just briefly because some of you may be interested in this as well. That we can use small amounts of nitrogen targeted as a foliar straight into the plant, where yes, we can optimize production, but not have some of the negative effects associated with that we talked about also. So just quickly, just so you know, yes, it is natural and normal for plants to take up nutrients through their foliage. We have many examples of this. Seaweed, ocean plants, aquatic plants, they all take up nutrients through the leaves. We have some great examples illustrating that even dust, fine particles of dust and dust storms that deposit on the leaf, that actually the plants can acidify their leaf surface and strip nutrients out of that dust. And this was from a study that showed that actually plants can obtain quite meaningful amounts of phosphorus from dust off the leaf by solubilizing that. Now, also, of course, animal and insect feces can also supply nutrients, be that through urine, etc. And even fog has been shown that some of the redwoods can actually absorb ammonia gas from fog. So yes, we have examples of plants making use of nutrients through the foliage. Now, foliar sprays is a big topic, and I'm not going to go into it. It was just to mention that it's a potential strategy. But I will acknowledge that there's a lot to know. Getting a good response really depends on quite a few considerations, such as the formulation, what you put into the spray mix, etc. How you apply it, the nozzle size, the pressure, those types of things, what the plant is, what the crop or species that you're applying it onto, and then what are some of those prevailing environmental conditions. All of these are important, and I'm not going to have time to go into all the variables, but I just want to emphasize that in terms of the crop, I consider that pastures are probably one of the most ideal model crops, model systems to make best use of foliar sprays, because you have such dense canopy, dense leaf coverage, no soil exposure, you don't have any inter-row area like in an arable context. So you have this nice perfect covering of matte high leaf area to capture that foliar spray and make use of it and prevent any of that nitrogen getting down into the soil. So I think pastures are one of the best and examples of this. And we do have some examples with farmers also in the UK, in Ireland, in Wales, who are achieving great reductions with their fertilizer use through foliar applications, 40, 50 odd % reductions through liquid foliar sprays in those more intensive type systems. So I think it is a good opportunity. One quick example, just as a recipe to give to you, urea is a very favorable form of nitrogen to use as a foliar. And that's because it is organic, as I mentioned, it has a bit of that free carbon, and it has a very efficient tendency to be very rapidly absorbed through the leaf into the plant. So urea works really well. It's kind of an excellent choice here. But as you can see on this list, I've also added things like a bit of amino acids or a protein hydrolysate, like a fish hydrolysate or amino acid product. These provide those organic amino acid, organic forms of nitrogen that we were talking about earlier that are also very, very efficient. So I would normally include a bit of a combination of the two. And then a few trace elements. You could just source a general trace element package. I put that in there because if you remember the metabolic pathway, we had molybdenum, we had iron, we had manganese, we had boron, a lot of the important trace minerals there that make nitrogen work as well. And then a carbon source, things like a bit of molasses or fulvic acid can work, and just a little bit of citric acid to acidify the spray mix. This is just a bit of a generic, generalized starter recipe. I know many farmers that use this kind of a basic idea with success, and it would just be a nice example of if you were interested in trialing something, that's a kind of a good beginner recipe. If anyone's interested in more of the foliar nitrogen discussion, early last year now, I ran a very detailed online course about this. It's 10 lectures, over 10 hours of lecture material. Everything was recorded. It's all uploaded on my website. And that is accessible if anyone really wants to get a deep dive into that topic. And of course, I must thank Emily, who helped me moderate some of those sessions. She was kindly enough helped me moderate some of those lectures. So, okay, and then lastly, I would just point out that if you're still using granular, which many of you probably are, that we have another strategy that we can also combine carbon sources with our granular fertilizers, and that's really just about adding extra carbon to nitrogen. Earlier to the question about hen muck and wood shavings, etc. It's the same kind of point. To our synthetic nitrogen, if we add carbon, that carbon binds to it, stabilizes the nitrogen, and induces a slow release kind of mechanism. So by wrapping, in this example, wrapping urea up with a carbon-based material, what we're doing is just changing the release pattern. We have a thicker arrow here going into kind of storage and retention, whereas without that carbon stabilizer, more of the nitrogen will release quickly into the soil water where it's more troublesome. So the practical implication of this is kind of taking a liquid carbon, and you could use things like things I've mentioned today: molasses, humic acids, fulvic acids, liquid seaweed, kelp products, amino acids, these types of things, and taking that liquid and just kind of coating it onto the fertilizer granules. And you can do that simply by running fertilizer granules up a conveyor or an auger and then just dribbling the liquid onto those granules, and it'll kind of rub off and rub onto those granules as they go up the conveyor into the hopper. Or you could do other things like bigger kind of mixers, or even feed wagons could potentially be used, that type of thing. But this is the premise here, is just trying to coat the fertilizer granule with a bit of carbon, whereby it will help to provide a sponge to bind to that nitrogen, to stabilize it and reduce some of those losses. Okay, in summary, nitrogen management, look, it is a double-edged sword. It's a delicate balance. It's good for productivity, of course it is, but it has some negatives. So we just want to find that sweet spot. A little bit is okay, but we definitely have to be careful about over applications. It can have more suppressive and negative effects. So therefore, whatever we can do to kind of dial down some of those nitrogen inputs, like foliars, carbon stabilizers, integrating legumes, more multi-species pasture, these are good strategies that will help reduce our reliance on those inputs. But also, as I mentioned, optimizing grazing, management, rest periods, root recovery. I think that's also how we manage the grazing is also a really important part of that discussion in order to get the best out of some of those legumes and or some of those other plants. Okay, so hopefully we've got some time for a few questions and a bit of discussion.
Fab, thank you very much, Joel. We have got a few more questions. Another one from Paul. Legumes like slightly higher soil temperatures that shortens the upland growing season. I know Paul's in NI. And he says with modern perennial ryegrasses, they suffer also with lodging. Is there any research into prairie grasses with respect to breeding back to resilient yet productive grasses?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I'm a little very interested in myself, because I think that we talk about some of our modern perennial ryegrasses as being very productive species, but I actually think that there's nuance here. It's not that they're necessarily so productive, it is that they are very responsive to nitrogen fertilizer inputs. And when you take away those nitrogen fertilizer inputs, they're not so productive. And so it's a subtlety there, but I think it's an important one, is that what we've done is breed a lot of varieties that are themselves dependent on those inputs in order to perform. And I do think that we do need to be looking back at some of the older varieties, or maybe just, again, breeding with slightly different goals, crossbreeding or doing some modern breeding with different goals in terms of plants that are efficient at accessing soil resources. But I know, like we have the Timothy's and the Cocksfoot. Look, I know some of those are great for their deeper roots. And you know, sometimes they can be a little less palatable, I think, also for some animals, depending on what they're used to. So you know, so I think there's a balance there. But I think for a beef context, certainly those are great choices. For sure. I know some of the dairy guys are a little more resistant or reserved about them, but again, that's the point of diversity. If you've got a mixed sward, you've got maybe some that are a little more or less palatable, but you've got a mixture there. Some of that are a little more or less good at the rooting characteristics, and we try to use that diversity to kind of not put all our eggs in one basket and to kind of even out some of those kind of pros or cons or type of thing. So that's kind of where I think the diversity comes in. And yes, look, to the essence of your question, look, I do think that there is some opportunities for better breeding. Breeding varieties better suited to lower input, you know, high efficiency type systems that have a lot more of the resilience that we're looking for and persistence. I know, you know, some of the multi-species swards have a few issues with persistence of some of those species as well. So that may be something we could also breed better to be more optimized.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Nigel. How would you determine the application rate for gypsum?
Yeah, good question. It's going to depend on your kind of soil analysis and your kind of existing calcium levels. But like as a guide, a general pretty safe application for gypsum is at your lowest point. Some might go as low as kind of like 300 kgs per hectare, something like that. But otherwise, generally, it's going to be maybe up around, you know, 1 or 2 tons to the hectares is a pretty safe general application rate of that kind of an input. Yeah, and just as a note, the gypsum, it's great at supplying calcium and sulfur, which can help with those high magnesium soils. But gypsum doesn't really increase the soil pH. So if you were wanting to top up your pH a little bit, gypsum is great for supplying calcium, but it doesn't nudge the pH up, whereas lime will. So calcium carbonate or limestone is going to help to top the pH up a little bit and supply calcium, whereas gypsum is better just to supply the calcium. And that can be a really advantage too, because there are soils that have adequate pH, but would still benefit from more calcium for the structural benefits that I mentioned. That's where gypsum is very useful and relevant.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Dowie. Typically, what is the difference in NUE between foliar N and granular N?
No, that's a good question. I talk about that at length in the online course, and we tried to unpack that one, and it's a very difficult question to answer for the simple reason that it depends on the different soil types and their ability to kind of hold and release and use the nitrogen in terms of those granular applied inputs. And equally, as I emphasized, foliars require a bit of intention and thought to design a foliar for success. It's not a matter of just throwing some liquid nitrogen in the tank and going for it. That kind of slap dash kind of approach. You really do need to design for some of those benefits. So you hear these kind of figures thrown around about, oh, it's foliars can be as much as kind of 2 or 3 or 4 times efficient, or you know, a kilo of nitrogen as a foliar is equivalent to 4 kgs on the soil. And again, I'm cautious of these statements because it depends on the soil and it depends on the foliar. But I've heard other figures that say it's 8 times or even 20 times more efficient. There's all sorts of numbers out there, and I don't have a clear and easy answer for you, apart from saying that yes, I hold the belief that they are more efficient because they can prevent some of the losses. And when you're preventing losses, that's how you're obviously going to then improve the efficiency of uptake and utilization per unit of what you apply. So from talking to farmers who have played around with this, I do think the answer does hover around somewhere in that 2 to 3 to 4 times. I think it's a fairly safe kind of concept, but I answer that with a word of caution. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. as a follow-up to the gypsum one, Nigel says in his instance, the calcium magnesium ratio is 10 to 1.
Yes, okay. So this is also why it is important to see a soil test too, because the ratios are valuable and that they are useful. So, however, to determine so put it this way, you could have a 10 to 1 ratio on a light sandy soil and a 10 to 1 ratio on a heavy clay soil. And therefore the application rate of the gypsum on that light sandy soil versus a heavy clay soil could be very, very different, even though they have the same maybe ratio of calcium to magnesium. So I'd need to really know a bit more about the heaviness or the lightness of that soil to then kind of really optimize the answer to that question. But in a lighter sandy soil, sure, I would only be going maybe up to maximum of a ton per hectare. But I think in a heavier clay soil, you could easily be hitting that, 2.5 tons or a ton per acre kind of thing, much more safely.
Okay, thank you. And there's one more question from James. Would mixing woodchuck with chicken muck, would the woodchuck not steal most of the nitrogen for composting? Or would mixing chicken muck with water make a foliar feed?
Okay, yes. So when you add the carbon, that woodier material to the hen muck, in a way, yes, you are right. It is stealing the nitrogen, but that's kind of what you want. You're wanting to put it through that composting process to then stabilize the nitrogen, to turn all that very raw, highly available nitrogen in the manure to actually compost it and integrate it with a carbon sponge that will stabilize it. So yes, it's a short-term loss during the composting process, but by the end of that, then you have some of these more stable forms of organic nitrogen that then, when you apply that composted manure, it is then a very favorable form. So it's a short-term release. So, and let me clarify, if you're talking about adding wood chip to hen muck and then applying it straight away, this is probably not a good idea. I would add that woody material and let it age, let it compost. And that's when you'll go through more of this transformation process of enabling the microbes to use that carbon to also use that, feed on the nitrogen and stabilize it. So I would age it minimum, but like really compost it ideally. Give it a couple of turns at minimum, maybe 6 months at a minimum, to then stabilize that nitrogen and the carbon together in these favorable organic forms. And the other question, could you just mix hen muck with with water to make a liquid? Yes, you could do that. There are manure teas. Obviously, you just have to be a bit careful with potential pathogen introduction. So you need to be mindful of that. In theory, yes, there's no reason why not to, from the nutrient kind of point of view of that kind of thing, but you do have to be a little mindful of the pathogen. So obviously don't let animals out on there and watch your withholding periods of that kind of thing. And if you were to do that, however, I would say that you'd be much better to do that with more of a liquid compost extract rather than a manure, just because at least through the composting process, again, you've dealt with some of the pathogens, you've stabilized some of the nutrients. I would suggest that you should kind of do it more through a compost extract rather than a raw manure extract would be more favorable.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think, well, unless anybody else has got any other questions, in which case, obviously type them in the chat or raise your hand quickly. But thank you very much, Joel, for sharing your expert knowledge this evening. I hope you've all found that useful. I think Sam's actually on his honeymoon, so prize goes to Sam for joining us tonight to come from his honeymoon to listen to Joel. So thank you very much. And yeah, no, hopefully you've all got a nugget there that you can take back and put into your action plan for helping your whole farm sustainability. So thank you very much. And if you haven't already let me know and you want to obviously hopefully join us next week, do let me know. And if you don't receive the link or haven't got the link, again, remind me and I'll send it individually so that hopefully it'll get through to you and not go into spam. So thank you very much and hopefully see you all next Wednesday. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.